Hello and welcome. So, no justice, no peace. A long time ago, I spent some time reading a law degree and preparing to become a lawyer, and it's a life I didn't live. Instead, I became an Anglican clergyman and an academic, and now, of course, a Catholic. But my family is peppered with lawyers. Many of us read law, some practiced, others didn't. Those of us who are non-practitioners may have lost touch with the niceties of changing legislation. And my goodness, they passed laws quickly and fast. But the eye for justice remains. And the lack of justice in our society is something that one feels very keenly. Never more than today. No justice, no peace. I've been out of touch a very long time, but I was enjoying a family barbecue in Clapham a short while ago, and I wanted to hear from my brother-in-law and my sister how their own practices were going. We were celebrating the fact that my niece, their daughter, has just graduated from carrying a judge's bag around for him from court to getting a training place in Chambers to be a barrister, to continue her training. I wanted to know about justice today, why there wasn't any. And so we found ourselves talking about what kind of barristers are promoted from the bar to be appointed as judges to the bench. It's all changed, and that's why there is no justice. Consequently, as the social activists pithily point out, no peace. For the rules of judicial appointment have changed drastically. Now, if you're going to be considered for promotion as a barrister, first of all you have to submit a portfolio demonstrating your commitment, both ideologically, what you believe, and practically, what you've done, to actively promote diversity, inclusion, and equity. I know other people call it DEI, but in terms of what it does to society, our culture, and our freedoms, let's call it DI. This means, of course, that our judges are appointed exclusively out of a pool of barristers who are all ideologically committed to the politics of the left. We could say the far left, and to the suppression and replacement of anything centre or right of centre. This would never be a healthy place for a judicial system to be in. It's particularly dangerous at this juncture where we are now. For some time, the public have been aware that the approach to public order offences by the police was becoming a matter of some complexity. The policing of Black Lives Matter, do you remember it? Their marches, the destruction of the statues of white men, the imprisoning of ambulances during the disruption to roads by green eco-protesters, screaming for genocide of the Jews by pro-Gaza protesters. They've all been treated with indulgence, with kid gloves, by the police. In parallel with the police, the judiciary have gone out of their way to compound the impression and the practice that non-Caucasians, to put it politely, are treated very differently from the indigenous English. It may not just be a skin thing. It turns out it may be a class thing as well. But social media has been awash with examples alerting the public to the leniency of the courts. The wide and the long backdrop to this has tragically and appallingly been provided by the raping of white girls by Muslim grooming gangs on an inconceivable scale. The researcher, Angie Heal, who was hired by local officials themselves, warned local authorities of the extent and scale of this criminal activity. In her report some time ago, she estimated that over 1,400 white girls were raped by grooming gangs between 1997 and 2013. The latest evidence is that she underestimated the numbers. The Guardian itself published the findings of a later report by ICSA in 2022, estimating that in Telford alone, 1,000 white girls were victims of rape and sexual molestation, and the police did very little indeed. The numbers of men arrested and charged were minimal, for the police were terrified of being thought racist. It became even more important to disguise the religion of the molesters and the rapists, so they just get described as Asian. A long litany of injustices perpetrated by the judiciary were recorded by a combination of the media, the social media, complemented a little bit by the mainstream press, but not much. To give you an example of some of the disparities, in August this year, an Asian civil servant, his name was Aimin Tuati from Sunderland, was given a suspended sentence of 12 months after being convicted of possessing child pornography on his computer. The youngest children were 6 months old. A suspended sentence. The account in the Daily Mail of an Islamic teacher, Suleiman Maknoja, who sexually abused an 11-year-old child, was that he was spared a jail sentence because he pleaded his Pakistani wife didn't speak English well enough for him to be sent away to jail. This caused a great deal of astonishment and resentment. The list of soft, indulgent, unjust sentences imposed by a left-leaning judiciary grew ever longer. And then came, unlooked for but perhaps not unexpected, the awful stabbing to death of 3 children in Southport. The authorities, as usual, did everything they could to obscure the facts, and they wonder why the people don't trust them. It was a Welshman, they said. He grew up in Cardiff. The people knew that the trust was broken, and many of them and their patience broke too, and they took to the streets. Douglas Murray has been warning that what happened was going to happen for a very long time, and he commented that the pent-up fury and resentment of the white working class, whose children they were, these children, had spilled out finally onto the streets and was being dangerously unleashed. So what was the response of the establishment? It was to urge the police and the judiciary to react with a forcefulness and a viciousness that took everyone by surprise. It seems that protesters could be arrested after all again. They just hadn't been because they weren't white, or if they were white, they'd been eco-strategists. We saw protesters on film being grabbed and beaten up by the police simply as a part of a strategy of intimidation, not even as a response to any criminal activity, unless waving your fist and gesticulating at the police is criminal. There was a 61-year-old train driver called David Spring in London, imprisoned for nothing more than making gestures at the police and chanting songs about Allah, whose lyrics I won't repeat here. They sent him to prison for 15 months. The judge who sentenced him made it clear the sentence was not just a response to what he did do, or mainly didn't do. It was intended to act as a deterrent to others. Its purpose was to discourage others from public disorder. Writing in The Spectator, Brendan O'Neill posed the question, is justice being turned into vengeance against the rioters? The answer, clearly, is yes, it is. He gave the example of Stacey Vint, a homeless woman of 34. She was handed a wheelie bin by other people in the crowd. I've seen the video of her tottering as she pushed it at about 2 miles an hour towards a police line. She tottered so incompetently that just as she reached the police, she fell flat on her face. They picked her up off the pavement. They arrested her. A judge sentenced her to 20 months imprisonment for falling over and failing to control her wheelie bin. O'Neill reminds his readers the knife man who terrorised staff at a kosher supermarket in Golders Green last January, demanding to know their views on Israel and Palestine as he threatened them, was given a suspended sentence. There's a judge called John Thackeray in Hull. He became quite energised as he made strident calls to prosecutors to consider changing the way the public were charged. He no longer wanted them charged with disorder. He wanted them charged under the offence of riot. Why? Well, you see, he just sentenced 26-year-old Connor Whitley to 3 years in prison for kicking a policeman. And he, the judge, suffered from his own frustrations. He couldn't send Colin down for longer. Now, he said, if the police would only charge these people with riot instead of violent disorder. Violent disorder carries a maximum sentence of only 5 years. He could have sentenced this man to prison for 10 years, which is clearly what he wanted to do. Justice or vengeance? The newspapers rubbed in the injustice and institutional partnership in what appeared to be a coordinated editorial shaming of the white working class. They ran headlines like "nailed" and "jailed" and put the mugshots of all these people on their front pages. Douglas Murray, I think, wisely suggested the fury of the establishment, which was expressed in two-tier policing and two-tier sentencing, was in fact an expression of near-desperate fear. He noted that although the far right are constantly blamed for the violence and the frustrated anger by the white, indigenous, working-class English, the far right doesn't, in fact, exist. There is no organised political far right. It doesn't exist. The media tried desperately to invent it, and all they could do was to point to the EDL, which they themselves had to admit ceased trading, working, was wound up 10 years ago, during which nothing, nada, no organisations, no organised far right. The frightening implication of this was that the establishment was facing a genuine, spontaneous uprising by the people, caused in part, Murray observed, by the refusal of the political class to either control mass immigration or even discuss it, or even acknowledge it. The Americans amongst whom Murray lives are astonished and perplexed at what's happening in Britain. They can't believe the British police have set up specialist units to patrol social media with the intention of arresting people for hate crime, thought crime, or racist tendencies. Their First Amendment makes such a response for them both inconceivable and illegal, and they're finding it difficult, as they should do, to digest the implications for the destruction of both freedom of speech and democracy in Britain today. No justice, no peace. Catholics, however, might not be quite as surprised as some others are, for we have watched as the police have initiated their anti-thought crime strategies for a while now on people worried about the mass murder of babies in abortion clinics. Now, for simply standing on the pavement within a buffer zone, praying in silence, people have been arrested for what is nothing other than a thought crime. Prayer has become criminalised. The police get to stop and ask you what's going on inside your head, and if they don't like the answer, they can arrest you. Catholics, during my lifetime, were often known for their commitment to peace and justice. Justice and peace groups abounded. Student groups and committed Catholic chaplains would quote Amos and Isaiah at the drop of a hat to you. Jesuits would lead the charge against political injustice all over the world with a practised steely glint in their eye. There'd been a slight suspicion amongst some that the target was always, and rather too easily, the economic and political right, suggesting that the passion for justice and peace was as much driven by socialism as a well-informed theology and spirituality, but it could only be a suspicion, until now. For where is the Catholic voice raised in defence of freedom of speech today? Where are the Catholic voices raised against the injustice of two-tier policing and two-tier sentencing? Where is the Catholic protest in defence of the white working class? Where are the voices raised in favour of the dispossessed when they happen to be the unfashionable? If the Catholic Church is going to defend its claim to speak with a prophetic voice rather than just a partisan and political one, this would be the moment for activist clergy and bishops who claim to have social consciences to raise their voices against the government in protest, to defend freedom of speech, freedom of thought, and our democracy. This would be the moment, wouldn't it?